Alright guys, so we're in our factoring unit, and the last time that we met, we talked about finding the greatest common factor. So we started off by finding the factors of an individual term, and then we moved on to factoring multiple terms and finding the common factor between them, and then finding the greatest common factor between those multiple terms. So today we're going to continue on that same path, but now we're going to be factoring trinomials. So we're going to take our trinomial in this form, and remember, a trinomial is just a fancy way of saying that it is a polynomial with three terms. So tri meaning three. So we're just going to find the factors of this trinomial. So we're going to have leading coefficient out in front of this x squared term is going to be our a. So we always have that implied 1 out in front if there's not a number there. So that is our a term. Next term, our second term in our trinomial, is bx. So that coefficient on the x term is considered our b. So in this case, the b would be that 8 right there. And then lastly, our c is our constant, and that's going to be the term that does not have an x on it. So that is going to be 12 in this example. So those are our that is our trinomial. Those are our three terms. And then we're going to go through these steps so we can factor. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to multiply the a and the c together. So in this case, our a is 1 and our c is 12. So as you can see, I've set that up for us already, and a times c, or 1 times 12, is 12. So when we set this up to get our factors, I'm going to write down our 12. Step 2 is to choose factors of AC that are going to add up to B. So we need to see what B is. So B is 8. And we need to figure out what our factors of AC are. So we've got 1 times 12, 2 times 6, and 3 times 4. Alright, so we want to figure out, step 2 says we want to find factors of 12 that are going to add up to 8. Well, what is 1 plus 12? Well, it's 13. That does not equal 8, so that's not going to work. What is 3 plus 4? Well, 3 plus 4 is 7. That one's not going to work. However, 2 plus 6 does equal 8. So this is our winner right here. These are going to be the factors that we use. So step 3 says what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite this b term, this inside term, using these factors. So what we did when we talked about foiling or using box method to multiply our two binomials together, and then at the end we had to combine our terms together. This is essentially like uncombining that center term. So let's go ahead and rewrite that center term at b. So we've got x squared, and then to rewrite this b, the center term, we're, instead of writing 8x, we are going to write it as 2x plus 6x, because those are the two factors that we chose that worked. So we're going to do, it's a positive 2x and a positive 6 were the factors. And then we've got to add our c. Now we could have written this as plus 6x plus 2x, so that order doesn't necessarily matter. It just might make the next step a little bit more simple as we get better at it. Alright, so the next thing we want to do is group the first two terms together. So I'm going to group these two terms together, and then I'm going to group the second two terms together. And so this method is called factoring by grouping. So I've grouped the first two, I've grouped the second two. And now we're going to go back to what we did on the first day of this unit, and we're going to look for a GCF. So we want to look at these two terms and figure out what they share in common. So since there's not a coefficient on this x squared, we're not going to be able to factor out a number, but we do share an x. So we can factor out a variable. So we're going to factor out our GCF is just x. So then I need to ask myself, what do I multiply x by in order to get to x squared? Well, that's simple. It's just x. X times x is x squared. And then I ask, what do I multiply x by to get to 2x? Well, that'd be a positive 2. So that is what this grouping looks like once I've factored out the GCF. So now I want to do the same thing with my second group. So I've got a plus, that stays the same, and then I'm going to look at my two terms here and figure out what the GCF is. So the GCF here is going to be 6. They don't share a variable in common, so I'm not going to be able to factor out a variable. So I'm going to open my parentheses, and 6 times what will give me 6x? Well, 6 times x gives me 6x. And 6 times what gives me 12? 6 times 2, so it's a positive 2. All right, so there is step 4 is, oh, looks like we have a little typo here. All right, so we found, this is step 5. So we found the GCF of each group. And now we want to write our factors. We're going to write it into factored form. So the first factor comes from inside the parentheses. So if you see inside the parentheses, they are identical. So that is what we want. If we've done it correctly, these are going to match perfectly. So our first factor is x plus 2. The second factor comes from what's written outside the parentheses. So you can see we've got this x outside the parentheses and a plus 6 outside the parentheses. So that becomes our second factor. X plus 6 goes inside parentheses. And that is complete. We have factored by grouping and we have factored our trinomial. If you want to double check your work, you can always FOIL this out. X times x, x times 6, FOIL it out, and once you're done and you've combined your like terms, you should end up with what we started if we've done it correctly. Okay, so let's go down to example 2. So the first step says that we are going to multiply our a and c together. So our a here would be a 1, and then our c is 18. So we're going to multiply a and c together. So a times c gives us 1 times 18, so that gives us 18. So let's go ahead and write out our factors of 18. So we've got 1 times 18, 2 times 9, and 3 times 6. All right, and then the second step says to choose factors of AC that are going to add up to b. So our b term is -9. So these can get a little tricky, so we have to be cautious. So if I add 1 and 18, I'm going to get a 19. So that's not going to work. Even if I was to make, let's say, one of these negative, it still wouldn't get me to -9. All right, so that one doesn't work. All right, so let's talk about the next one. What if I do 2 plus 9? That's going to give me an 11, but I need it to be a -9. So what if I made the 2 negative? Well, -2 plus 9 would give me a 7. That still doesn't work. What if the 9, what if they were both negative? That gives me a -11. Okay, so these two factors are just not going to work. So let's look at the last set of factors. We've got 3 plus 6, so that gives me a +9. I need it to be negative though. So in order for me to get this 9 to be negative, I need both of these terms to be negative, because -3 plus a -6 would give me a -9. So there is my winner. Those are my factors that I'm going to use to rewrite that b term with. So if we go to step 3, we're going to rewrite b. So we start off with our a, which is x squared. And then instead of writing b as -9, we're going to write b as -3 minus 6. So we've got -3x. We've got to include that because b has an x on it. And then minus 6x. And then plus our 18. Okay, so all we did was we uncombined that middle term. Alright, so the next step says to group the first two terms together. There you go. And group the last two terms together. Alright, so we are going to find the GCF of each group. So, what's my GCF of this first group? Well, there's no coefficient out in front of the x squared, so we're not going to have a number, we're just going to have a GCF that's a variable. And it looks like they both share one x, so there's our GCF. Open our parentheses. X times x will give us x squared. X times -3 will give us -3x. So that is our first grouping done. And then we want to factor our GCF out for our second grouping. So we want to bring that subtraction sign down. And we want to look and see what they share. So in this case, they don't share a variable, so I'm only going to be factoring out the greatest common factor as far as the number is concerned. So our greatest common factor is going to be a 6. So -6 times what gives me a -6x? Well, just -6 times x. And then what times -6 will give me 18, a positive 18. So I need it to be a -3, because a 6 times 3 is 18, but negative times the negative gives me that positive that I'm looking for. Alright, so I found the GCF on each group. Now I'm just going to rewrite it into factored form. So I want to check and make sure that my first factor comes from inside the parentheses. I have to make sure that my parentheses are correct. They are, so I've done it correctly. Alright, so that first factor is x minus 3. The second factor comes from outside of the parentheses. So I've got an x and an x and a -6. So I've got x minus 6 as my second term. So this is the factored version of my trinomial. Alright, let's look at the next example. Let me slide up to example 3. Alright, so here's our A is going to be 1, since there's an implied 1 out in front of that x squared term. Here's our B, it is -3, and then our C is -10. So we're going to set this up and do our A times C. So 1 times -10 gives us a -10. And then our B is -3. So what are my factors of -10? So I can have 1 times 10. One of these needs to be a negative. So it could be like that, or it could be like that, because those would both give me a -10. Then I've also got 2 times 5, but one of them needs to be negative because that and the product is negative. So I could make the 2 negative and the 5 positive, or the other way and make the 5 negative. Alright, so those are all of my factors. And now I want to figure out which one of those is going to add up to -3. Well, -1 plus 10 is going to give me a positive 9. That does not work. That's not what I'm looking for. 1 plus a -10 is going to give me a -9. That doesn't work either. Then I've got -2 plus 5. That's going to give me a positive 3. So that one doesn't work. But then 2 plus the -5 gives me a -3. So there's my winner right there. I've got factors that multiply together to get -10, and they're going to add together to give me that -3, that B term that I'm looking for. Alright, so the next step is to rewrite our B term using these two factors. So I'm going to start off with x squared. My 2 was positive, so that means it's going to be a plus 2x. My 5 was negative, so that's where I'm going to write it as a -5x. And then lastly, I write my C term. So the only thing that I changed is I just rewrote this middle term using these factors. Alright, now I want to group the first 2 terms together and group the last 2 terms together so that I can find the GCF of both of those. So my GCF, or what these share in common, the greatest common factor between these two, is going to be just an x. X times x will give me x squared. X times positive 2 will give me a positive 2x. Now I'm going to pull that minus sign down, and I need to factor out the GCF here. So my GCF here is going to be a 5. So negative 5 times x will give me negative 5x, and a positive 2 times negative 5 would give me a negative 10. Alright, so now I need to rewrite this as into factored form. Both of my inside parentheses are exactly the same, which is perfect. That's what I want. I've done it right. So that first factor comes from inside the parentheses. The second factor comes from outside the parentheses. So the second factor is going to be x minus 5. And I have now written my trinomial in factored form. All right, let's do another example. So example 4, we've got a is 1, and our c is 9. So a times c, or 1 times 9, gives us a positive 9, and our b term is a positive 10. So I'm going to look for factors, list out my factors, and then find the one that adds up to 10. So factors of 9 are 1 times 9, 3 times 3. So if I add 1 plus 9, it gives me a 10. If I do 3 plus 3, that gives me 6. So this one's not going to work, but this guy right here is our winner. It multiplies together to give me 9, and it adds together to give me 10. So I'm going to rewrite my b term with these two terms. So I have my x squared, and then plus 1x plus 9x, and then I write my c. I'm going to group the first two terms together, group the second two terms together, find my GCF, which in this case is just an x. Inside the parentheses is x times x will give me x squared, and x times 1 will give me a 1x. Now I'm going to do the same thing with my second grouping, just like we've been doing. So I've got a plus that I bring down, that positive, and my GCF here is going to be a 9. So I open my parentheses, 9 times x would give me 9x, and 9 times 1 would give me 9. Alright, so do my parentheses match? They sure do. So that is my first term. We've done it correctly. X plus 1. And my second term comes from outside the parentheses. So my second term is going to be x plus 9. This is my factored version of my trinomial. And again, like I said, if you want to FOIL this out or do the box method to check to make sure that you've done it correctly, you can. When you do that, it's going to give you the same answer. Here, let's go ahead and just check our answer real quick. We can FOIL this out. So we get x times x is x squared, x times 9 is a 9x, 1 times x is a 1x, and 1 times 9 is 9. So then I look to see if I have any like terms that I can combine, which I do right there in the middle. So I'm going to combine those. So x squared, 9x plus 1x gives me a 10x plus 9. And then I want to look at this and see if it's what I started with. And they are a perfect match. So we've done all of this correctly, and that is the correct version of, factored version of my trinomial. Alright, let's do this last example. It is a little bit different because you'll see there are two variables. There's an x and a y variable, but don't be overwhelmed. We're going to do this the same exact way we've been doing, okay? So it's not any more tricky than any of the other examples. So we're going to start with our a times b, or I'm sorry, a times c. So our a here is a 1, and our b is a -7. So -7 times 1 gives us a -7. Then our b term, so our b term is a +6. So I want to write out all of my factors of -7. So that could be 1 times -7, or it could be -1 times a +7. And that's going to be all of our factors. So let's see which one adds up to +6. Well, 1 plus a negative 7 gives us a negative 6, so that one does not work. And then negative 1 plus 7 is going to give us a positive 6, so there's our winner. Those are the factors we're going to use to rewrite this center term. So I start with my first term, which is x squared, and then I want to rewrite this middle term, this b term. So I've got a minus 1, and then I put my variables on it just like I did before, and then a positive 7 and include my variables. So that's simple. All right, then I just write my c term. Okay, so now all I'm going to do is group these together and then factor out my GCF of both of the groups. So here, they're not going to share any numbers in common. So, because we don't have, I mean, you could factor out a 1 if you wanted to, but it's really not necessary because we do have a variable that we can factor out. So they only share an x in common. So that's my GCF. So I need to ask, what do I multiply x by to get to x squared? Well, just x. What do I multiply x by to get to a negative xy? Well, I'm going to multiply it by a negative y. So x times negative y would give me a negative xy. Because remember, I don't have to have that 1 written there, but I just wanted to write it because I wanted y'all to see where that factor went. Alright, so then the plus comes down, that positive comes down, and I want to look at my GCF here. Well, we can see right off the bat they both share a 7, so I'm going to have to factor that 7 out. And they both share a variable. They both share one y. So let's factor out that y. So my GCF of this last group was a 7y. What do I multiply 7y by to get to 7xy? Well, I just multiply it by an x. And then what do I multiply 7y by to get to negative 7y squared? I'm going to have to multiply it by a negative y. Because that'll make negative 7 times the negative, 7 times the negative gives us a negative 7, and y times y gives us that y squared. Alright, so are my two factors, my two sets of parentheses are the same, so we've done our GCF correctly. So we're going to take that first term from inside the parentheses, and the second term comes from outside the parentheses, so that is x plus 7y, and that is my final answer in factored form. Alright guys, if you have any questions, please let me know.